Horror these days, it just lacks subtlety. It lacks class. There's no suspense or mystery, no intrigue. It's all just hack and slash and blood everywhere. Reminds me of my high school reunion. It's all spectacle and no substance, not like the classics. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula. That episode with the hash-slinging slasher from SpongeBob. Now that's the right speed for true chills up your spine. The next story is something with less fire and explosions and more mystery and suspense. It's of course the classic tale of the Mary Celeste, a true tale of the classic Victorian era that still mystifies and stupefies us to this very day. Let's begin, shall we?
The 5th of December, 1872, 400 miles west of the Azores, Captain David Morehouse stood on the deck of the British brig De Gratia. His eyes cast eastwards, face creased with concern. There, drifting aimlessly, was a square-rigged brig. The merchant ship's sails were half set and a bit tattered, her course erratic and directionless. As the De Gratia closed in, Morehouse's concerns were realized. The floundering vessel was the Mary Celeste. He recognized her. She had left the same port as him with the same destination. But she had departed New York 8 days before he had, her destination Genoa, Italy. She should have been there by now, but here she was, decks bare and helm spinning. Morehouse sent out a boarding party. The men rowed over to ascertain just what the vessel was doing and if they needed assistance. As they pulled alongside, the small brig was silent as could be. No one greeted them at the side. Climbing aboard left more questions than answers. There wasn't a soul aboard. The 10-person crew had simply vanished, with not a trace to be found. The boarding party split up, searching for answers. The main hatch was opened up and secured. Within her cargo hold was her charge of 1,701 barrels of industrial denatured alcohol, untouched and unscathed. In the cabins, all the crew's effects were where they had been stowed, nothing rooted through but the charts and the captain's navigational equipment. The logbook was found in the mate's cabin, and the last entry was 9 days prior, indicating the Mary Celeste was off the coast of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The stores aboard were ample enough for a journey 3 times as long. It was as if a fully provisioned ship had simply been dropped in the sea without a crew. The only sign of any damage being about 3.5 feet or a little over a meter of water slashing about in the bottom of the hold. A good amount of water, but nothing fatal to the vessel. On top of that, one of the ship's 2 pumps had been disassembled, the pieces laying on deck next to it. The ship's lifeboat was no longer in its cradle, and nowhere to be seen. The lines of the rigging were unkempt, some separated, some even trailing behind the Mary Celeste. But for all intents and purposes, she was seaworthy. It seemed that the crew had abandoned her out in the middle of the Atlantic, or her crew had simply been killed or disappeared. But why? Dissatisfied with these findings, but not seeing much sense in leaving the ship to collect barnacles in the open ocean, Morehouse took control of Mary Celeste and sailed her to Gibraltar. Full of cargo, but light of crew. What had happened to them is a mystery that lasts to this day, with no lack of theories and ideas. A ghost ship story that's older and more famous than any other.
And that's the long and the short of it. The mystery of the Mary Celeste. An old classic ghost tale, as aged and befuddling as it is true. So, what do you think of that, Poindexter?
Yeah, that's about it. That's what happened.
What? No, this is only episode 2 of the spooky month, and you're already ruining our dynamic.
What?
I'm the lovable scamp that people like because I believe in fun, spooky ghost stories, while you're the boring curmudgeon that nobody likes because you shit all over the story with your annoying facts and bore us to death.
Well, unlike the Ourang Medan, the Mary Celeste did exist. She's a well-documented ship and her crew did in fact go missing. But there have been some wild theories that have cropped up to explain the fate of the crew. But the truth is actually pretty mundane.
Ah, now that's more likely. Explain away, nerd.
Well, by the time the Mary Celeste's crew disappeared, she was actually over a decade old. In fact, she was still used even after the crew disappeared for over another decade. The ship's story began in 1860 when her keel was laid on Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia. Designed and primarily funded by a man named Joshua Dewis, the man was from a nearby town called Economy. This was not his first foray into shipbuilding, having built smaller skiffs and schooners. But this would be his largest, and would help fund the shipyard he wanted to start on the crescent-shaped beach on Spencer's Island. She was launched on the 18th of May, 1861, not as Mary Celeste, but as the Amazon. Some legends say her launching wasn't without its hitches, saying she got stuck on the ways, but this hasn't been confirmed. Her home port being Parsboro, Nova Scotia. She was 198.4 tons in total, 99.3 feet or 30.3 meters in length, 22.5 feet or 6.9 meters at the beam, and she had an 11.7 inch or 3.6 meter navigable draft, and was just one deck. She featured a brigantine sail plan that suited the smaller ship just fine. Upon her launching, one of her co-owners, a man named Robert McClellan, was selected as her captain. When Amazon was about to set out for her maiden voyage, Captain McClellan had felt a cold setting in, but made little mention of it, saying that the salty sea air would set him right as rain. The ship set sail in early June of 1861, heading for nearby 5 islands to take on a load of timber. Afterwards, she would sail 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to London. But seemingly the moment he stepped on board, the captain seemed to take a turn for the worse. After taking on her cargo, the ship hadn't even made it past New Brunswick when the captain's cold had become pneumonia. It was determined that there was no way he would make the cross-Atlantic trip, so the crew returned home after only a week. 2 days after returning to shore, Captain Robert McClellan passed away.
Aha, so there you go, Captain dying a week into the maiden voyage. That's how you get haunted. Case closed, like his casket.
Dude.
I mean, how very sad. Continue.
Anyways, the maiden voyage was to continue, now under command of Captain John Nutting Parker. The Amazon once more departed Nova Scotia for London. But the string of misfortune wasn't yet done with her. Off the coast of Maine, she ran into some fishing tackle, having to have it cut away. Even worse, after months at sea, she arrived in the English Channel, only to accidentally ram and sink an English brig.
Definitely not cursed or haunted.
But after this disaster of a maiden voyage, the ship began a rather mundane life as a merchant ship. She conducted most of her trade in the West Indies with occasional runs across the Atlantic. Nothing of great note occurring for 2 years, when Captain Parker departed and was replaced by Captain William Thompson, who continued to operate the vessel with no noteworthy occurrences until October of 1867. A nasty nor'easter caught the Amazon as she was returning to Nova Scotia. Captain Thompson battled to get the small brig into the lee of the Bay of Fundy, but the violent seas bat around the ship like a cork in a bathtub. Faced with the demise of the entire ship, Captain Thompson had but one option: to go aground. So he ran the ship aground on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. The Amazon so heavily battered that it had to be deemed a wreck.
I'm telling you, haunted.
It was less than a month when someone acquired the wreck as a derelict. For a few months it changed hands until it was purchased in November of 1868 by a man named Richard W. Haynes, who cleaned up the wreck and made it seaworthy again. He also renamed the ship to Mary Celeste, which, as we know, can have poor consequences if not done correctly.
Wait. Bad christening.
Allegedly.
Changing the name of the ship without a renaming ceremony.
Possibly.
Captain dying on the maiden voyage.
Definitely.
How exactly was this thing not cursed?
After renaming the ship, Haynes registered the ship to New York, but apparently he wasn't the best captain or businessman, because less than a year later, the ship was seized by the man's creditors, trying to collect a debt that he owed.
Honestly, they probably did that dude a solid with that one. It's the scariest thing of all. Bill collectors! was. Moo.
The ship was then sold off to a consortium owned by a man by the name of James H. Winchester in October of 1869. But either no logs were kept or none have been found for the ship during this time. But in 1872, we do know that she started an extensive refit. In this refit, the ship was put up and enlarged substantially. Her length was increased to 103 feet, or 31 meters. Her beam became 25.7 feet, or 7.8 meters, and her draft dropped down to 16.2 feet, or 4.9 meters. She now also had 2 decks instead of just one. In total, her tonnage went from 198 tons to 282 tons. After the refit, a new captain was selected. One of the joint shareholders of the ship, Benjamin Briggs. The 37-year-old from Wareham, Massachusetts, was a seasoned sea captain by this time in his life. He had married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb of Plymouth, Massachusetts, his cousin. No comment. She was 31 years old by the time they started the journey, and had 2 children, 7-year-old Arthur and 2-year-old Sophia Matilda. Briggs began gathering crew to get the ship underway after the refit. Albert G. Richardson was married to James Winchester's niece, and also sailed with Captain Briggs, so he was selected as first mate. The second mate was a 25-year-old man from New York named Andrew Gilling. Based upon personal recommendations from Mr. Winchester, Edward William Head was brought on as the ship's steward. Then 4 seamen were hired, all of which were German. Brothers Volkert and Bas Lorenzen, Arian Martens, and Gottlieb Gutschall. Finally, Briggs would be bringing with him to Italy his wife and their young infant daughter, Sophia Matilda. Jeez, you think taking your young kid on a 4-hour plane ride is rough? Imagine a 2-month transatlantic crossing. Yeesh. Young Arthur Briggs was attending schooling, and thus had to stay home with his grandmother. It would turn out to be a mercy for the 7-year-old boy, as he would be spared the fate of his mother, father, and baby sister. So in the early morning of November 5th, the Mary Celeste departed Pier 50 in New York and made her way out to the harbor. This would be the last time that any of the 10 people on board would be seen alive. What happened next we only know from log entries and the remains of the intact vessel found nearly a month later by the De Gratia, which had left New York a week after the Mary Celeste. Now the story doesn't end here. After finding the ship, Captain David Morehouse of the De Gratia made the determination to bring the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, to attempt to claim salvage rights on her. Under maritime law, a crew could claim a percentage of the value of the ship and cargo if they were to bring it back intact. Morehouse had to make no little effort to do so, seeing as he had to split his already small 8-man crew between the 2 ships. But the seas were calm, and he arrived in Gibraltar 600 nautical miles away on the 12th of December with no major issues. But receiving the salvage rights wasn't a done deal. A court was adjourned to determine the amount of which the crew of the De Gratia would be paid. Chief Justice of Gibraltar, Sir James Cochrane, would oversee the hearing. Meanwhile, it would be conducted by Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood. This man has been seen unfavorably by history. One historian says about him as being a man whose arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ, and as the sort of man who, once he had made up his mind about something, couldn't be shifted. It didn't take long before the Attorney General suspected that foul play was afoot, either on the part of the De Gratia or by part of the crew of the Mary Celeste. He ordered an investigation of Mary Celeste to try and determine who was to blame here. The investigation located 2 matching cuts on either side of the ship's bow. Also, the captain's sword was found in its sheath in his cabin, and found stains on its blade, possibly blood. Also located were a few stains on the railings, again possibly blood, as well as a deep cut mark to a railing, perhaps by an axe. With this evidence, the Attorney General laid blame on either 2 things: the crew of the Mary Celeste getting into the alcohol on board, despite it not being drinkable, and killing the crew before taking off in a lifeboat, or the De Gratia doing the same and claiming the ship for salvage. He believed the logs on board to have been forged, and the ship to have been located further west than was claimed. But further, more scientific research determined that the stains on the sword and the railings were not blood at all. A research from the US Navy also determined the cuts on the bow to not have been deliberate, but normal wear from heavy waves acting on the bow of the ship. Begrudgingly, Solly Flood had to determine that no guilt was to be found due to a lack of evidence. The Mary Celeste was released back to Mr. Winchester, the ship's owner. The crew of the de Gratia was paid around a fifth of the value of the ship and cargo, nearly half of what they should have earned. Perhaps as a sign that the court still didn't believe them to be fully innocent of any wrongdoing, despite a distinct lack of evidence to show it. Shortly after, the Mary Celeste departed Genoa, Italy, for New York, arriving in September of 1873. But less than a year later, Winchester sold the ship off. Perhaps for the best. The ship had already claimed 2 captains in its lifetime, and an entire crew, many of which were close personal friends of his. He sold the ship at a considerable loss to a consortium in New York, perhaps for her reputation well known at this point. She continued to sail mainly in the West Indies. She mainly operated at a loss for the company, generating paltry numbers for the New York business. In February of 1879, the ship pulled into the island of St. Helena to offload her captain, a man named Edgar Tuthill. He had fallen ill on the voyage, seemingly out of nowhere. He died a short time later, the third of Mary Celeste's captains to die prematurely. The ship was sold again a year later, in February of 1880. The new owners were a group of Bostonians who operated Mary Celeste for a few more years, trying desperately to earn a profit from the now over 20-year-old ship, a not insignificant age for a wooden vessel of this time. There was also the added superstition surrounding this now well-known ship that had killed 3 of her captains. With declining revenue, a new captain took command in August of 1884, Gilman C. Park. The man quickly determined that the ship had outlived her usefulness. But of course, simply selling her or scrapping her wouldn't do. Oh no, not enough money in that. So he conspired with a group of Bostonian shippers, taking on a cargo hold of worthless goods, then insuring them for $30,000, worth nearly $1 million in today's standard. On the 16th of December, he set out from Boston to Port-au-Prince in Haiti, with one goal in mind. On January 3, 1885, he was entering port through the main shipping channel. In the middle of the channel was a very well-documented reef, Rochaloy Reef. Intentionally, Parker rammed the reef, tearing out the bottom of the Mary Celeste and damaging her irreparably. Her career was over as the men rowed ashore to claim the insurance money.
Oh dang, so that's not so bad. They made a quick buck off of a maritime disaster. Reminds me of my high school reunion.
They would have, had they not been very quickly found out and tried for insurance fraud. Parker was even almost tried for barratry, or what we call in the modern Coast Guard gross negligent operation, which is the intentional misoperation of your vessel that could or does result in the loss of life. Back in the day, that carried the death penalty.
And there goes Captain number 4.
Well, not quite, but almost. The charges of barratry were deferred after the judge organized an arraignment, only ordering the insurers to repay what they had been paid from the fraudulent claims.
Alright, enough of this. Boring facts aside, let's get to the fun part, the crackpot theories. I mean, I already know it was ghosts. It's clearly ghosts. But let's hear some of the juicy stuff people came up with 150 years ago.
So let's go over the theories and knock these things out. First and foremost, as with any ghost ship, the main crackpot theory being ghosts or aliens. As always, I'll not even be favoring this theory with a rebuttal. There's no evidence to say it wasn't, yet no evidence to say it was, so there you go, think what you want. Next, and equally as insane, is the theory that it was some sort of sea monster, which seems like, well, I don't know where this idea comes from, but the theory says a sea monster just popped up, made a snack of the crew, then disappeared into the sea. The issues with that being that the crew was gone, as was the lifeboat and the captain's navigation tools. So I guess the sea monster was like, alright, I'm gonna eat you, and you, and you, and ooh, I'll take this neat little boat and this sextant. Yeah, I don't think so. The other idea being that the Kraken or whatever ate part of the crew, then the remainder went, yikes, you see that? Let's escape in this even smaller boat. So no, I think we can rule out sea monsters pretty definitely. Next is the old reliable, the pirates, that old battle axe. I swear every ghost ship people blame pirates. I feel like my next anatomy of disaster needs to be on pirates to explain how they work. They aren't just the serial killers of the sea. If the ship is intact and the cargo is still on board, you can probably bet it wasn't pirates. They don't just kill people for fun, they're there to make money. So with no blood found on the ship, none of the cargo missing, and all the personal effects of the crew on board, it's probably fair to say it wasn't pirates. Next, of course, is Frederick Solifaud's theory of a mutiny on board. He believed that the members of the crew had gotten into the ship's cargo of alcohol and gone into a drunken rage before killing the officers of the ship, before taking nothing and fleeing in the lifeboat. This theory, of course, is just as crazy as the pirates one. First of all, it's industrial alcohol. No one is drinking that, and if they are, they probably won't be fighting afterwards. Secondly, there was no blood or signs of struggle found on board. Third, who slaughters a crew, takes control of a ship, then just gets on a lifeboat and rows away? No, that's not it either. Now, out of the realm of crackpottery and into reality. One pretty highly held theory is the belief that an explosion from alcohol vapors occurred in the hull of the ship, scaring the crew off the ship. This is tenuous, seeing as no damage or singeing occurred to the ship, but it was apparent that some of the alcohol in a few of the barrels had leaked out, amounting to something near 300 gallons. Also, small-scale tests have shown that an explosion like this could feasibly occur without leaving marks on the boat. But the main issue being that the main hatch cover was properly secured open when the crew of the De Gratia arrived, meaning the crew had opened the hold. So they were either not too concerned about another explosion, or the hold was well ventilated at the time they departed. No lingering vapors were noted by the De Gratia crew. There, of course, is the conspiracy that the De Gratia crew had conspired to kill the Mary Celeste crew and take in the ship for salvage. But that would be rather impossible, seeing as the Mary Celeste had left a full week before the De Gratia, and was miles ahead of her. She would have had to stop for quite a bit of time for the De Gratia to even catch up. So, what do I think happened? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious and far less exciting. Mary Celeste got caught in some bad weather. We know this because De Gratia had to pass through similar weather. Also, the ship's sails were pretty rough and she had a good amount of water on deck. The ship had pumps, but prior to this, she had just been refitted. On top of that, she had previously completed a voyage where her cargo was a load of coal. A refit is bound to leave dust and particles if not cleaned properly. On top of that, coal can be quite messy too. Once Mary Celeste started taking on water, they would utilize the ship's pumps before one of them becomes jammed. Note why one of the pumps was partially disassembled. Worried now, the captain thinks his ship might be sinking. He's got his wife and infant daughter on board. But as stated in the log, they were right off Santa Maria Island. Briggs could probably even see it at this point. He's a choice to make: stay and fight to keep the struggling Mary Celeste from foundering, or hop in the lifeboat and make for the safe shores of the Azores. So he gathers his navigational gear, loads into the lifeboat with his men and his family, and sets out for the relative safety of shore, never to be seen again. Briggs was a seasoned sea captain, with years of sea time and experience. But if that was enough to avoid making mistakes, well, I wouldn't have a YouTube channel talking about maritime disasters. Humans make mistakes, and with his family on board, he was under quite a bit of pressure. All the evidence points to it, but it seems 150 years is more than enough time for facts to get muddled and insane theories to crop up. But there you are, the true story of the Mary Celeste.
Ah, the science of the late 18 to early 1900s. I miss the days of curing coughs with heroin and tree padding, solving women's hysteria with questionable methods. You can enjoy your scientific reasoning. I'll be over here enjoying my crackpot ghost pirate shenanigans and getting my humors balanced.